NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rahsaan Hall, and yes, I am a former prosecutor. Thank you. I want to thank you. I knew that was going to happen. So thank you, Jeff, for the invitation. I truly appreciate it. I'm really excited to have this conversation around the use of social science data and just disclaimers. There's going to be disclaimers all over the place. First of all, I know I'm not really telling you all anything that you don't already know. Second of all, I am not a data person, so I'm going to talk about data generally, knowing that there are other people well more versed and have a lot more expertise in the subject matter and how to use it. Thank you for NACDL for having this conference and being intentional about discussing race in the work that you all do. I've been invited to speak a lot of places, and I always say if you're not discussing race in the conversations that you're having, you're doing a disservice. And so one of the main things that I hope that you all take away from this conversation is this idea that there should be ways that we can address and attack the system collectively through the use of intentional litigation strategies and coordinated work together, not just as the defense bar, but with other people. So the context of this conversation is in part due to all of these images and all of these names that we have seen time and time again. Black people who have been killed by the police, black women who have been killed by police, and the conversation that a lot of people aren't really talking about, the number of Native Americans, First Nation people who have been killed by the police. And it's certainly there's been a conversation in light of the uprisings that we've seen throughout the country, but nobody was able to really get a good count or put their finger on how much this was happening until the Guardian did this project that counted, and it shows these gross disparities in how many people of color are killed by police. You'll see in 2015 of the 1,146 people killed, black people were killed at a rate at 8 per million, and Native Americans at 5.5 per million, and Latinos at 3.5, while white were at 3. And and this was right around the time of Ferguson, and so law enforcement folks like to talk a lot about the Ferguson effect, which was law enforcement not doing their job because of fear of reprisal or uprising from the community. And so I guess in one way you could say this is kind of a good perspective. If you think that part of police work is to kill people, then you see that the Ferguson effect actually worked because they weren't killing as many people. Now, I'm being facetious, but we do notice that the number of people killed has gone down. The disparities have shifted, but that is, I think, what truly the Ferguson effect is how people have reacted to this information. It's particularly disturbing when we look at the number of people who were unarmed and killed by police and the disparities that exist there. Are we killing more white folks now? No, we're just trying to level the playing field. And so what this gets us are these images, and these images are important because there are ways that we approach the system. We can do it in what some may say uncivilly, and rest in peace to this brother who was found murdered about a year after this photo was taken. Or we can do it civilly, and this is the way that people in communities of color who are over-policed are confronted on a daily basis. People try to do things civilly, hands up, don't shoot, to raise the conversation, but then they're labeled as hate groups and terrorists. But when you get that coming at you, it's very likely that that is going to be the response. Some may say civil or uncivil, and if that is uncivil, what about this? Would you say is that civil? And so rightfully so, there is a lot of frustration and anger and demands for change that are directed at police, to talk about police accountability. but the conversation also needs to shift from the streets to the courts. There's a very important and valuable role that advocacy takes in community, but there is also another important role that happens in the courts. My colleague at the ACLU of Massachusetts, Matt Siegel, wrote an opinion piece in The Guardian entitled "Beyond Black Lives Matter, Police Reform Must Be Bolstered by Legal Action." And you all are a part of the legal action. The movement for police reform should be joined by an equally ambitious movement for court reform. That is the premise of this article or this opinion piece, and it's essentially this. For as much as we want to take to the streets and have community conversations and police oversight boards to talk about how policing needs to change, there is an architecture or a structure in which they exist, function, and operate that is created and ordained by the courts. There is this deadly precedent that exists that lays out how police are able to govern themselves as it relates to people that they are pursuing or investigating. And so, Tennessee v. Garner, a very disturbing case where an officer shoots an individual in the back of the head while fleeing, and the question the court has to answer is whether or not law enforcement can use that amount of force to stop a fleeing suspect. And the court determined that when they're pursuing a fleeing suspect, that they may not use deadly force to prevent the escape unless, look at your neighbor and say, unless. The officer has probable cause to believe that the suspect poses a significant threat of death or serious injury. And so you take Tennessee v. Garner and you add Graham v. Connor, where an individual who was going through diabetic shock was suspected of being involved in something nefarious at a convenience store and pummeled by police officers, and it was determined that it was reasonable for that officer to do that given the reasonable officer standard. And yet, then also we have Wren versus the United States that basically says pretextual stops are okay. And so this is a part of, there are so many other cases that deal with the architecture that allow policing to happen the way that it does. But we have to take a new kind of multifaceted advocacy approach. In his book, the ACLU's legal director, David Cole, wrote in Engines of Liberty, he talked about the role of civil society in really changing the discourse. And he looks at the equal marriage movement, and he looks at the NRA, and he looks at human rights movements. And the main premise, or at least the takeaway for me, was that the legal arguments haven't really changed that much, but what's changed is society. We went from talking about marriage, the right to marry, to talking about love. Right, and then that changes, and so he talks about the community advocacy piece, which is extremely important. And then when he talks about the litigation, we have to think about the impact on judges. This idea of cultural cognition, the way that judges interpret empirical data and facts, is through the lens of the culture in which they exist and where they live and the life experiences that they've had. And another important piece here is this idea around choice of venue. A lot of the significant cases that have led to transformation of our society didn't always start with litigation in federal court or immediately going to the Supreme Court. Sometimes it's what bubbles up in the state courts. And so I know there were some jokes just made at the expense of Massachusetts using cases from the 1600s. But you know what? I tell you one thing, we have a constitution that's the oldest in the country, and it is based on that constitution and that Declaration of Rights that we have some pretty progressive laws. So I'll just say that. And then, of course, the use of social science data. And I think for me, a perfect idea around what this looks like was from the mastermind of Charles Hamilton Houston, the Brown versus Board of Education. Even though Thurgood Marshall was the one who litigated that case, it was the design by the master architect himself, Charles Hamilton Houston, that took this approach to really litigating in the social context. And one of the things that really made the day in this case is some of the social science data, right? We are looking at the impacts of segregation and living in a segregated society, and Dr. Kenneth Clark does this experiment with these dolls. Again, I'm not really telling you all much that you don't already know, but to those who may not know or not be that familiar with it, it's the study about looking at these dolls in the way that black children who are under oppression, who are living in a country that is built on white supremacy, how do they react to being in segregated schools? And so, you have a child confronted with a white doll, the black doll. What do you associate the negative attributes with? Which doll is the bad doll? They point to the black doll. Which doll is the ugly doll? Point to the black doll. Which is the stupid doll? Point to the black doll. And then ask the child, which doll do you most associate with? Some of the black children say, I associate with the white doll because I'm not ugly, I'm not stupid, I'm not bad. But can you imagine what it must be like for a young black child to have to go through that experience at that time and say, this is the bad doll, this is the ugly doll, this is the not smart doll, this is the doll that looks like me. There was social science data to show what the effects of oppression and segregation and white supremacy, the effect that they had on society. Imagine if we could do that more in the criminal justice realm or the criminal injustice realm, depending on how you look at it. Any NCAA fans, football? Okay, we got a few. I went to the Ohio State University, so for me to be here is a challenge. You can't imagine what my flight was like, seeing all that yellow and blue. But just in case, I'm wondering, I might try this OH. Y'all can't say nothing to me now. So this is Marquise Weeks, University of Virginia, back in 2004. He ran back a 100-yard punt return. And, it catches in the 1-yard line, runs all the way back, scores a touchdown. They blew out the University of North Carolina, so any Tar Heels in here, I don't know if you remember this particular game. But essentially, when asked about it, the brother said, it was just instinct. And he chuckles to himself. He said, it's kind of like running from the cops. And that usually gets a good laugh, but why is that funny? What is it about this society that makes it a normal or an instinctive thing for young black men to run from cops? It's the way that policing happens in communities of color. And I'm sure as Jeff talked to you earlier in this conference, there is a long history that is rooted in this nation's history and roots in slavery, that black folks have been running from people with badges since eons ago, or generations ago, rather. And so, as Jeff likes to say, it's funny until it's not. And so imagine if we can take a multifaceted advocacy approach to criminal law reform. And here is an example of a case that was influenced by a multifaceted advocacy approach, and it's the Commonwealth V Warren. And essentially, this is the case that has caught a lot of headlines by letting folks know that it's okay if you're black to run from the police. And that's not exactly what the case stands for, but word on the street is you can run from the cops and they can't do anything about it. Commonwealth V Warren is this case about Jimmy Warren. The facts of the case are interesting. And just let me give another disclaimer. This title of this presentation is using social science data in pretrial or to win pretrial motions. This information that led to this decision was not a part of a pretrial motion, but it underscores the value of outside advocacy and the use of social science data. And the other part is that, information like this that the court ultimately uses to make this decision shouldn't be left to happenstance. There should be an intentional and coordinated effort to put this information before the court, to get the studies on what the impacts are of racial profiling in communities of color are. Put that before judges. And so Commonwealth v. Warren, Jimmy Warren is a young man who was arrested by police. He went to charged with possession of a firearm, went to trial, filed a motion to suppress. The motion to suppress was denied. And here's the thing. What the facts were about were an individual, young man at his home around 9:20 in the evening, gets a call or hears somebody in his room, goes into his room, sees somebody hopping out his window, somebody in a red hoodie, looks around his room, sees that his backpack with a laptop and a couple of hats are missing. They call the police. Several minutes later, a police officer arrives, gets a description from the victim and his mother about what he saw. Essentially, he saw somebody come in his room, hop out the window. They had a red hoodie. When he looked out the window, there were two other individuals in a black hoodie, appeared to be black men, but no other description than that. And they took off and gave a general direction of flight. No, there's not a point. Anyway, and so the officer drove for a 4-block radius for about 20 minutes, didn't see anybody, and it was a cold December night. There weren't a lot of people out on the street. And finally, on the way back to the station, some 25 odd minutes later, the officer, Louis Anjos, sees somebody walking near a park. And he sees that individual and says, hey, can I, and two individuals, I'm sorry, Mr. Warren and his companion walking near a park and says, hey, can I speak to you? And Mr. Warren and his associate run through the park. Officer Anjos calls for backup, and on the other side, an officer, Chris Carr, interesting story about him, sees Mr. Warren coming out of the other side of the park, and at that point, Carr says, stop. Pursues Warren, who takes off running, and then they arrest him or stop him, place him in handcuffs, and then search the house near where he was stopped, and there was a gun recovery, and he was charged with that gun. And so the Court of Appeals agreed with the lower court that the motion to suppress was appropriately denied, but in the dissent, Judge Peter Agnes wrote some pretty, I think, compelling made some pretty compelling comments, and he is the one who made initial reference to the ACLU's report, which was the basis for this case. And one of the things that he said in talking about some of the history of this community is, in addition to understanding the local geography and particularized suspicion, a page of history about encounters between young black men and the police in Roxbury is worth a volume of logic. And so I don't know how many of you know a lot of the history of Boston and Roxbury, from busing, or in particular the Charles Stewart case where he killed his wife, Carol DeMata, in Roxbury, then blamed it on some nondescript black man, and there then became this search on site policy where brothers were just getting hemmed up by the police. Young kids coming home from school being stopped in the middle of the day, in the middle of the street, being strip searched in public because the cardinal rule had been broken. A black person had killed a white woman. And because of that, the neighborhood was torn upside down by law enforcement. And so there is this history that just didn't go away in 89 or 90 when Charles Stewart killed himself, and it became apparent that it was a whole ruse to cover his own lies. But this is a part of the neighborhood where this happened. And you'll see from the map down at the bottom where that bottom thumbtack is where the robbery happened. To the up and to the left is the general direction of flight. And then the bottom of the top three thumbtacks is where Mr. Warren was initially seen. That's the park he runs through, where on the other side he's seen by Officer Carr, and then that's where he's later apprehended. That's almost a mile from the original location of the stop to where he was ultimately stopped. And so there's a lot of conversation about the context of what was happening to black men in the Roxbury section of Dorchester. And so the case went up on appeal to the Supreme Judicial Court, and they made it a particular point to talk about what happens in Roxbury, looking at, again, the ACLU report for black, brown, and targeted. And so, the court looked through whether or not the officers had reasonable suspicion to stop Mr. Warren. They looked at all of the factors that the lower court judge used in considering whether or not there was reasonable suspicion. If this individual matched the description, being in the proximity, there being no other people around, and then ultimately his flight. And so the match description, it was just vague that it was a black man in a hoodie or two black men in a hoodie, but one of them had a red hoodie and another one of them had the victim's backpack. It was just Mr. Warren and his companion, one in a dark hoodie. But that's all that was. Nothing about complexion, nothing about height, nothing about weight. And from the map, you can tell that that was just one direction. There are a whole bunch of other directions. There's a park that he could have immediately ran through, but the officer just checked a specific location. So that in and of itself wasn't enough. The proximity wasn't enough. The absence of others wasn't really significant. And then when looking at the flight of the individual, it drew on a history of Massachusetts cases that said flight in and of itself can't be a basis for pursuing someone, or even breaking eye contact and accelerating your pace can't in and of itself be a basis. But when you take all of these factors and consider them together, it can be considered. And I think that's an argument that has existed, but yet and still judges made ruling like the lower court judge made and the Court of Appeals judge made. What has changed, I think, is a lot of the information and the opinions and the data that has been presented to the courts. The work of our report, Black, Brown, and Targeted, was highly publicized at the time that it came out because it said good old Boston, that is this bastion of liberal progressivism, had a problem with race. And this is the same Boston where the Boston Marathon happened and the Boston police did a heroic job. Yes, it is exactly that same Boston. And so we had a history of issues with the police and community. There were a lot of community complaints about what was happening in the community with the police, the way that they were still stopping and harassing and frisking people. And so we took this information and we asked for the records that showed what Boston police was doing with what they call the FIO reports, field interrogation, observation, and search reports. And they wouldn't give it to us, or they said, well, you'll have to pay $112,000 to get the records. So we were preparing to sue, and then ultimately they said, you know what, let's compromise. We'll pull the 2007 to 2010 data of all the FIOs and give it to independent researchers, Anthony Braga and Jeffrey Fagan, who did the analysis. And the goals of the study were to determine the extent to which officers documented stops, frisks, and searches in these reports, the nature and the scope of any supervisory review of these reports, the impact, if any, of race on the decisions to stop and or to search. And so this is what the report, and also the incidents of stops and searches in different times and locations in the city of Boston. And here are some of the findings. Of the 204,000 reports, that was the total number of reports that were filed. Of that, black people made up 63% of all of the stops and encounters, but we only make up 24% of the city's population. The argument is, of course, well, that's where all the crime is, right? So, you'd like to think that police do policing in an unbiased and just way, but even when they measured for crime in different ways, and again, I'm not a statistician or a data person, so I'm sure it can be said more articulately, but when you measure for crime, either by looking at the crime rate in the neighborhood, or looking at an individual's arrest history, or looking at alleged gang involvement of an individual, there was still a racial disparity in who was being stopped. The greater the concentration of people of color in a particular neighborhood, the greater frequency at which stops and frisks of people of color happened. You have two similarly situated communities, one white, one black, similar crime rates, you'll still see a greater likelihood that black people are being stopped in those communities. It showed that regardless of these other issues, arrest record, alleged gang involvement, that black people were still being stopped more frequently. And they were also, young black men were much more likely to be repeat targets of police stops and encounters. And so I'm sorry that you really can't see this. That's the other disclaimer. I never took the PowerPoint class in law school, and they didn't have it in seminary either. So, but that's just the basic breakdown of the population. Again, the disparity, 24% black, but 63% of the stops. And again, that's even after for controlling for crime. For those of you all who didn't go to Harvard, BU, or Suffolk, or Northeastern, or are not from Massachusetts or Boston, take a guess which part of the map is has the greatest concentration of people of color. I kind of gave it away with the slide, but take a guess which section of the city has the highest rates of poverty. Take a guess which section of the city has the highest percentages of arrests for drug offenses. And I'm sure you could probably guess from this map which section of the city has the highest concentration of underperforming schools, or the highest concentration of non-native English speakers. The Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, that corridor that runs through Boston, highly racially segregated in that it is predominantly black or Latino, people of color concentrated in that area, as well as higher rates of poverty. And so again, the argument being, well, that's where the crime is, but remember, they controlled for crime. Here's another disturbing part of this study. It revealed that the basis for those stops, 75% of those stops were just to investigate person. It's been a while since I've been in the courtroom and practicing as a prosecutor, but I do remember that in order to stop someone, it needed to at least be reasonable suspicion. I don't know that investigation rises to the level of reasonable suspicion, but I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've been in court. So that investigate person was just amorphous, and it allowed officers to do pretty much anything. Now, what that also accounts for are people who were just being observed by the police from a distance. But it still also accounts for officers coming up and talking to people and patting them and frisking them and detaining them for significant periods of time. And now currently, because of the release of this data, they have changed their reporting structure. And so 21% of all of the stops now are for people who are actually encountered. 14% are for those who are observed, and 64% are for people who are stopped. And so I don't know that, in the last 4 years, those percentages have changed that much. And so even though that 75% is investigate person, if it's now only 14% that are being observed, the vast remainder of that are people who are being stopped, encountered, and or searched. And then lastly, this is just bad policing. Like 95% of these stops, they didn't document any seizures or arrests. So that goes to show that there's something left to be desired in these policing practices. And so it was this study that the court looked to refute all of the concerns around an individual's flight. And Justice Geraldine Hines, the first African-American woman appointed to the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, and a brilliant legal scholar, but also a black woman, said in her opinion when addressing this idea of flight, it says, flight is not necessarily probative of a suspect's state of mind or consciousness of guilt. Such an individual, when approached by police, might just as easily be motivated by the desire to avoid the recurring indignity of being racially profiled as by the desires to hide criminal activity. And so that is the value of the social activism that's happening when people are out saying Black Lives Matter. Judges don't live in a vacuum. They begin to understand that there is a reason why someone would say Black Lives Matter. Whether or not they agree with it, it's in their mind. There is a reason that this data is helpful, because it can be used to be put before judges who, even if they don't want to accept it, in every case, they'll be familiar with it. The more that they are confronted with motions to suppress or pretrial motions to exclude evidence or to analyze evidence based on statistical analysis and social science data, the more they are going to be confronted with the reality that they are going to have to reconcile the cultural context in which they live and this objective idea of how the law is to be applied. And a lot of times it just don't match up. And so I believe the role of you all is to be in community advocating. And I say that in two ways. One, the reason that we knew about the stops and frisks is because we were engaged with community. People were coming to us telling us this is the issue. And so because of that and some other things, we began to pursue that. And I know given your practices, it may not necessarily line up that way, but having connection to community, which I'm sure many of you do, is also an opportunity to look in to issues. And so the solicitation, I don't know if any of you all have seen I'm Gonna Get You Sucker. But there's this part where, some people laugh, there's this part where Chris Rock is in it, and he walks into a restaurant. And he asks the restaurant owner, who's Jim Brown, and says, "How much for one rib?" And he's like, a stack of ribs is like, whatever, $8. And he's like, no, not the whole slab, just one rib. And he's like, one rib. Okay, whatever. And he negotiated the price. I think it was just like $4. And Chris Rock pulls out this big wad of cash. And it's like, "You got change for a 20? And the man yells at him to get out. And so here's the ACLU, who people believe are flush with Trump money, soliciting defense attorneys to say, "How about just one rib?" But it's more than a rib. We're really thinking about the ways that we can strategically attack that deadly precedent that exists by using social science data. And so if there are cases that you all are litigating, and there is an avenue for reform or repeal of a particular area of law, given your state's constitution or some pretty good state case law, that's something that we want to know about. We might be able to file an amicus in support of that. And also, if there are empirical studies that back up some of the disparities and the impact of those disparities, that's information that we would love to know about. Or if those studies should happen, that's something that we would love to know about. And I'm going to point everybody to Jeff, even though he didn't give me permission to do that, but I know that it is a priority of ours at the ACLU. And so if there are those cases or case opportunities or requests for amicus support or studies that you know about or feel should be done, reach out to us, because we really do need to change the conversation. Thank you.